This is American Government on Wednesday, November
Hey,
3rd.
turn the camera to face now. Say hi.
No.
This is the class,
Yeah.
Wait, what other notes do we need?
the ones for Monday and the ones for today.
So the one
Now, I also, by the way,
No.
did you see this? I passed out an article to you earlier by email, and I just decided to make sure that you looked at it. I printed out for you too. So this is an article from yesterday's Wall Street Journal.
Oh, can I read it?
Not right now, but I'm going to refer to it briefly, probably not in today's lecture, but on Friday's lecture, because it talks about the way our two-party system is operating today and the challenges that that poses for presidential leadership. And it just so happens, not that I, by telepathy or by mental powers, can control the flow of events so that they coincide with my lectures. That would be a wonderful power to have, let alone to get. And by the way, here's the other thing that happened. Driving back from class on Monday, I was stopped for speeding and got a $340 ticket.
What?
So I'm actually going to contest it, I think. So I am a law-abiding person, and he said I was going 53 miles an hour in a 35-mile-an-hour zone. I'm going to contest it.
Where were you going?
Was it about South Carolina?
No, it was actually 2 blocks from my neighborhood.
I can't help.
So, well, could you help me otherwise?
Okay, I'm sorry, but
No. I think I'm going to actually contest it because that's part of our rights is the ability to contest things in court. I don't think I was speeding. So there. All right. What I want to do today is finish up with the question of the reform of the two-party system, and then we'll start the presidency today by looking at its origins, and that is primarily by looking at the excerpts from the Federalist Papers as contained in the Nichols Reader.
Sydney asked you a question.
And by the way, I said by the way again, even though I said I was going to stop saying by the way.
Well, that'd be like saying you're going to stop being.
I know, but once you watch a recording of yourself and you realize you say something over and over without thinking of it, it makes you aware of it. You have a question, Sydney? Sydney, you have a question?
She said, "Did you ask him how you're going to contest it?"
Yeah.
Because I had stopped behind a fire truck and was turning 2 blocks after that, and I don't think I could have possibly been going 53 miles an hour since I came from a full stop and then to turn left. So,
Maybe he was trying to be.
by the way, have you ever gotten a ticket before?
Nope.
I've got him one.
Can you request for the radar readout?
You should be able to. I feel like you should be allowed.
What are you going? I can ask my dad because that's what I was saying. I can help you with it.
It's not until March 22nd. But if you're stopped for speeding, is it your legal? I really don't know this. Is it your legal right to ask for the radar readout? If he says you were clocked going 53, can you compel them to prove that?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you can.
I would think so.
I can clarify or like.
Ask your dad. I'd be curious to know.
That's what I was saying. I can help you because I ran stop signs, speed, whatever. I've gotten out of all those tickets.
Well, I don't know. I don't think I want to hear that part. All right.
Yeah.
So, if you're looking at the middle of this article I just passed out from the Wall Street Journal, today we'll start the presidency by looking at origins and original intentions. Friday's class will deal with historical changes in the presidency, and that is primarily Chapter 10 in the Wilson Reader. But there is another reading from the Nichols Reader and that's actually from a campaign speech by John F. Kennedy during the 1960s on the nature of modern tasks of leadership.
It says they're not required to show you.
Okay. But can you ask them? Can you request it?
Well, you can, but they're not.
But if
required
they're lying,
to.
they're not.
And if they show it to you, it's just as a courtesy to deter future speed. And if they won't show
You would
they're
think it would be
probably
essential to their proving their case in court.
Yeah,
would think.
but
Anyway, all right, I didn't mean to distract, but I have to say that it's been on my mind. I even walked slower across the hall to come to this classroom just for fear of getting a speeding ticket. I went to the restroom and I walked slower than. No, I'm just. The Kennedy campaign speech on the presidency is it's a short speech, and he gave it when he was running for president in the 1960s. This is what you're reading for Friday. And in it, he talks about the 4 kinds of leadership that the modern president requires. And you're going to see that leadership is something that even Hamilton anticipated in the presidency. I'm going to walk you through those essays when we come to that material in a minute. But one of the 4 kinds of leadership that Kennedy says the modern president requires is party leadership. Now, we'll talk about the tensions in this idea, but if you read this article from the Wall Street Journal, the essence of Gerald Sabe, he's the author's article, is it's difficult for President Biden to exercise party leadership because there are, in reality, 4 different parties on Capitol Hill right now. Not the House and Senate Democrat and Republicans, but his argument is within each of the 2 major parties, there are now 2 sub-parties that make governing difficult. I think that the article is true and insightful, and I will come back to that on Friday when we talk about how the president is also a party leader. And let me just say that when we talk about the tasks of the executive that Hamilton talks about in the Federalist Papers, as replicated in the Nichols Reader, party leadership is not one of those kinds of leadership. Why? Because parties didn't exist at the time of the constitutional drafting. So if you remember, from my account, both of the Electoral College, but also from the party system last Friday and Wednesday, parties grew as part of our constitutional system after the founding. Generally speaking, I'm an admirer of the founders and of the constitutional system that they created. Having said that, they were not gods and they didn't foresee everything. And one of the things they did not foresee was the rise of political parties and, in some ways, the necessity of political parties for the functioning of our system. Now, here's where we were. If you're looking at the notes on Monday, do you all have those? Y'all have those? On the second page where it says Roman numeral 3, we had finished major changes in the modern era of parties. And this was based both on the Wilson chapter, but also on the Caesar article on parties and constitutional principle. And I just wanted to talk about some other aspects from chapter 7 of the Wilson Reader that are part of our contemporary party system that you need to understand certain developments. First of all, in the 1970s, campaign finance reform was passed. What does that mean? Prior to the 1970s, anybody could contribute to any party or candidate in any election as much as he or she wanted. If you were a gazillionaire, you could give $1 gazillion to someone's campaign. After 1970, there were 3 kinds of restrictions put on. The amount that individuals can contribute to a candidate, and originally it was about $1,000 per candidate per race. That's pretty limited, by the way. It was raised in the early 2000s to about $2,000. It put a $20,000 limit on what parties could contribute to candidates' campaigns, and a $5,000 individual or group limit. The law, by the way, also put spending limits on how much candidates could spend on a campaign, but that was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1974 on the grounds that the amount of money that you spend is actually a form of freedom of speech. Do you understand that argument? If you have money and you want to spend it on anything you want, you can spend it on anything you want. And the First Amendment says you have the freedom of speech, you have the freedom of press, right? If you're running for office, the Supreme Court held that part of your personal freedom under the First Amendment as a candidate is to spend however much and what money you want. So the Supreme Court said that spending limitations for candidates unconstitutional, but the contribution limitations that was constitutional, and that is still part of our campaign environment. However, I have to tell you that since 2010, there is one other exception to campaign finance, which has become very controversial. The limitations I just described from the 1970s reforms are the limits that you or a party or a group can contribute to an individual directly. But the Supreme Court held in 2010 in Citizens United, that case, that you as a donor can actually give to a third party as much as you want. I'll just tell you how this case came about. There was this anti-Hillary Clinton PAC that made a very damaging video of her. And they solicited contributions, and they got gazillions of dollars. And they ran this ad in the Iowa caucuses when Hillary Clinton was running as a candidate. And they sued Citizens United that made this video, the Democratic Party did, on the grounds that it violated campaign limitations. But the Supreme Court held, no, this wasn't actually to her campaign. This was to a third party. And since they had held earlier that you can spend however you much, again, if you hate Donald Trump, if you hate Joe Biden, if you are in favor of Brandon, sorry,
That's funny.
I have to say, I think that is funny. Anyway, if I wanted to start the Let's Go Brandon group and I raised $2 billion, even though, whom would that hurt if I ran a campaign showing Let's Go Brandon? It would hurt Biden. But the Supreme Court said because you are not actually connected with his campaign and you are not actually, even if the message that you are applying is for or against him, as an independent party, you can spend as much as you want. And so that means third parties, and they are, and those today are called SuperPACs, more about that in a minute, are actually become a major source of funding in our campaigns. And so this is another way. It's a kind of a way of evading some of the campaign limitations. Now, a second big development because of these limitations were PACs. Have you ever heard of the concept PACs? I think Wilson describes it. It stands for Political Action Committees. At the time of the 1970s, only about 4% of all campaign finance money was channeled through PACs. Who actually forms PACs? Many industry groups do. Like the AMA, the American Medical Association, has its own PAC. It contributes to candidates. It raises and contributes to candidates. The American Bar Association does. Many other professional associations do. Many local organizations do. Today, PAC money, Political Action Committee meeting money, now accounts for almost half of all the contributions given to candidates. Now, why is that important? Because it means that parties actually have become even less important. Parties still raise money for candidates, they still spend money, but they're limited on how much they can spend on a candidate. And one of the things that means is that today candidates are forced to operate their own campaign and do their own fundraising. And that means, you remember when we looked at Congress and one of the criticisms was that members of Congress are just re-election machines, whores, if you will, that are contributing, trying to get money for their re-election? Oddly enough, one of the side effects or the unintended consequences of campaign finance reform is it has forced members of Congress, for instance, to raise more of their own money directly from the interests that they regulate in legislation. So in an odd way, this is an example of unintended consequences. The whole point of campaign finance legislation was to prevent any one person or group or party from having too much control over a candidate. Does that make sense? In reality, what we've done is we haven't eliminated money from politics. We've kind of forced it through the back door by regulating it at the front door. Does this make sense? Again, this is, I think, an example of what we're going to see in Banfield's article is an example of unintended consequence. It may have actually made the system worse. The last major development, interestingly enough, is the rise of television advertising. And that's also connected with the rise of campaigns. Now, in the last election cycle, Americans spent about $5 billion on political ads and campaigns. Is that a lot?
Yeah.
Do you know how much we spend on pets a year?
Mm-hmm.
$9 billion.
Oh, dang.
So is $3 to $5 billion a lot to spend on politics?
Yeah.
I don't know, it depends on what you're comparing it to. Now, one thing that other nations have that we don't have, which some people advocate, I think it's a mixed bag, is the public funding of campaigns. For instance, in many countries in Europe, there is actually a legal limit to the campaign season, and all candidates and campaigns and parties are actually funded by the government. Voters contribute to them in proportion to their vote. So on one level, that would be a way perhaps of holding down the cost of campaigns. But the public funding of campaigns and the idea of a legal limit, I mean, you might say this, and as I pointed out, by the way, here's the result of all these reforms, if you're looking at the middle of the page. Our presidential and our congressional elections, nomination and election contests are completely now popular and democratic. Why? Because they're decided by popular election or primary elections. Do you remember we discussed that on Monday? Moreover, our campaigns are now more demagogic. That is to say, they are more emotion-based. They are longer, more expensive, more negative, and more polarized. So on one level, the cumulative effect of a lot of these reforms was actually to create a worse party system than we had before. How does that relate to television? Because television is the single most expensive form of political advertising. More than printing, more than handbills, more than door-to-door. even more than the internet, although more parties and more candidates are spending money on the internet too. So we'll come back to the reform question now. Is the two-party system a good thing? What's so interesting over there?
I was wondering what speed is, so I tried to.
Oh, bless your heart. So what would replace the two-party system? What do most people have in mind when they want to replace it? And would that be better? So, starting with Lexi on the bottom of page 2, I say, remember the alternatives. Read that.
Remember the alternatives and remember that fact that people tend to vote according to 3 criteria: party, issue, candidate.
You remember we discussed this on the Monday. The things that determine most people's votes, even today, even though party is a weaker element, people still vote primarily by party identification, by the issue involved, or by the candidate. So, what if we had no parties, abolished parties, or didn't have parties? Would that be good? Read on.
No parties, voters only vote on issues or candidates.
Do you understand what that means? If we didn't have party labels, if you walked into a voting booth and you didn't have Democrat, Republican, socialist workers, or whatever, and you were a voter, what would be the only way that you could intelligibly make up your mind on what you were choosing? Either some issue that you knew that one of the candidates was for, or some of the candidates that you liked one or the other, right? So imagine then an electoral system with no party labels. People would either vote purely by issue or by candidate. Go ahead.
No enduring structures that link issues, people, or regions of the country together, or the various branches of the national government and the states. No stable institutions that hold candidates responsible to their campaign sequence or organize the shape the behavior of office holders. No institutions that organize and funds candidates other than the candidates themselves. One party.
So in other words, by the way, if you're imagining, if parties were to disappear, the only thing that would inform of people's voting behavior would be the candidate or particular issues. Would that system be better or worse than we have? I suggest some reasons here, by the way, what might be worse. After all, candidates make promises, don't they?
Yeah.
Yeah, but most of the time they don't keep them.
And that is true, by the way. Most of the time they don't keep them. And if there were no parties, either opposition parties or parties that supported people in power, strictly speaking, would candidates be more or less responsible to the electorate?
What was the
Go ahead. I'll say the question again. If there were no parties, and remember the functions that parties play in our system. They organize candidates, they provide campaigns, they provide labels and information. If you took away parties and people simply voted on single issues or simply by the candidate, the idea of the candidate, again, you have to remember walking into a voting booth, and let's say there were 23 candidates for president. What's missing now? What don't you have on the voting booth, on the voting ballot?
Parties.
You don't have parties. So if you're going to make an intelligible choice among 23 different candidates with no party labels, how are you going to make an intelligible choice?
You have to do research on 23 people.
And how much do you think contemporary Americans are structured to devote that much time to researching the political background of their candidates?
No.
Like 5%, not even.
And what about, okay, so you see the problem. If you take parties out of the equation, there's no stable issue that links candidate promises and behavior. There's nothing that forms coalitions except around particular issues. Would government be more fractious, more unstable, more stable, more coherent? What do you think the effect would be? And would candidates be more or less responsible?
Candidates would be more responsible.
You think that they would be more responsible?
Wouldn't they?
Because they would have to explicitly like express all this stuff. Like, I don't know how to explain it. Like, I know, okay, so like, for instance, Joe Biden's a Democrat, so you know he probably holds certain beliefs about himself.
You know for sure, because that's been the basis of his governing program.
So if they didn't have parties, then he would have to explain the dumb stuff that we already know because he has the label Democrat now.
So you're saying without party labels, candidates might be more responsible because they'd have to explain all of their individual positions.
Yes.
Is that what you meant?
Yeah.
Do you want to say something, Tiffany?
I think it would be less because they could change their mind at any moment and they would be kind of argued, whatever.
Okay,
Because people don't. Does that make sense?
Both have good houses.
All right, Matt, did you want to say something?
I was just saying they'd be less responsible because they don't have a party to hold them accountable, or like
Either opposition party or their own party.
Yeah, they're not. They don't represent anything except themselves, so they can do whatever.
And given how much television advertising, I have to say, I am not a supporter of television political ads
That crap's so dumb.
because they are so manipulative. And the thing is, can you imagine, wouldn't wealthy candidates craft their own campaign staff like their own advertising staff? In other words, you would find perfectly crafted political commercials that probably convey no real information. At least with parties, you could say, you have a stable presence in the environment that holds their own candidates to a program so much as you can. Anybody know what happened yesterday with respect to, now again, I asked this on Monday, where is President Biden right now?
He was with the Pope.
No longer. Where is he now? He's in Scotland.
Why is he in
For
Scotland?
what, Sabrina?
I don't know.
For the golf. He's attending the COP26, the climate program of the United Nations right now, pressing his climate bill. Where is his climate bill at this point in Congress?
It's passed. Or it's passed both.
No. The infrastructure bill, which was bipartisan, has passed the Senate, and the House is waiting to vote on it. What's the other big Biden Build Back Better bill? That's being held up by actually 2 senators.
Is it for student loans?
The Build Back Better isn't it about preschool programs and stuff?
All kinds of things. It's a massive expansion of the welfare state. Plus, it contains a good deal of $550 billion spending on climate issues. Now, you could say that, so at this point, the Senate is what, party-wise?
Split.
50-50. So, in other words, what must the Democrats have to pass that bill in the Senate?
100% support.
They have to have 100% of Democrats supporting it. There are 2 Democratic senators that at this point, and they forced important modifications in the bill up to this point. And yesterday, Joe Manchin, one of them from West Virginia, and Kristen Sinema from Arizona, Joe Manchin just yesterday said he will not vote for it unless the spending and the taxing programs are more clearly spelled out. Now, you could say, well, wait a minute. Here you have one Democrat holding up the entire progress of the Democratic Party. That may be in some ways. But at least what is it forcing the Democratic Party to do?
Think about the bill more.
And to explain it more to the people. Does that make sense? So the question I'm asking is, what would our political landscape look like if we had no parties? Would candidates be more? And what about single issues? Have you ever had something important to you today that yesterday didn't seem as important, or tomorrow will be taken over by something else?
Yeah.
What?
Have you ever had something important to you today that wasn't? I know this is kind of a cumbersome way to ask it. Isn't it true that politics has millions of different issues?
Yes.
If you're voting on one issue, if you're a single issue voter, the problem is what links that one issue to other issues, and what makes sure that there's a stable progress on many different kinds of issues. For this, so do you understand? What if you're simply pro-choice and that's all determine you vote? Is everything in politics pro-choice?
No.
So on one level, if you had no parties and people only voted on candidates or single issues, the question I'm asking, would the political system be more fractious, more more uncoordinated, or more coordinated, or hard to tie together? If you took away party labels and party organizations.
Hard to tie together.
I think, especially in a system of separation of powers and checks and balances, where you already have good divided institutions, I think you could argue that politics minus parties would probably be almost impossible to conduct. I think that's probably one likely. So that's one alternative. Would taking away parties be better than what we have now? Problematic.
Yeah.
What about one party, Sammy?
I don't know. I feel like my opinion is just not good right now.
Well, how about reading where it says one party?
Not have to design like one-party dictatorships, and it's probably not likely or not good.
So is a one-party system a probably likely alternative in our system?
No.
No, because first of all, almost all one-party systems are dictatorships.
Yeah.
Or one-party states like California, or a couple of other states like Washington, Oregon, or New York, or the District of Columbia. Now, I have to say, when you look at one-party systems that are not even by design, one problem is there's no restraint on the major party. Generally speaking, whatever the party leadership wants, it gets, because It's a one-party system. Does that make sense? And when you look at actually one-party systems, as I mentioned before, there's a good deal of hidden corruption. Probably you are all too young to remember something that happened in China about 10 years ago. There was a massive earthquake, and 40 to 60,000 school children were killed. It wasn't as if the earthquake targeted schools, but what's the link? It led, by the way, to one of the most massive outbreaks of parental protest in China, which was quickly put down by the party, which controls all forms of public expression. What was the connection between school buildings, the death of school children, and party corruption? Because it turns out on the local level, where the Communist Party controls everything, they also cut deals for inferior materials and also cut costs in construction. So the reason the earthquake revealed that was many of the public buildings, especially schools, were not built according to qualifications. And therefore there was this outcry about the party. If one party controls everything, almost everything happens behind closed doors. Does that make sense? And indeed, that is the way that one-party systems like North Korea, et cetera, are all governed by internal party mechanisms. Two parties is what we have. So what are we really talking about? The real possible alternative to a two-party system. Haley, why don't you read? 3 or more parties, a multi-party system. And I have to say, when people think of reforming our two parties, it is this alternative that they generally have in mind. Go ahead.
Stanford's interesting plans to create a system according to the systems made of the American two-party system, then add a of our present system.
So the Banfield article that I asked you to read in defense of the two-party system, what he tries to do is to create a thought experiment. What's the nature of the thought experiment? The kinds of criticisms that people make of our two parties, that they are too broad. After all, there are a lot of political issues, right? If you only have two parties, then that means almost all issues have to fall within that lens of two broad coalitions, right? So when most people will want what they want as an alternative is they probably want lots of, like in Israel or Italy, for instance. Both Israel and Italy are parliamentary systems. They have a parliament with a prime minister. Israel has actually 36 different political parties. Now, what does that mean in terms of the electorate? When you vote in Israel, you vote by party, pretty much the same as Italy, which has about 30 political parties. And parliamentary systems like Britain and France are different because they have some stable two-party background. But if you're a voter with a system with 30 parties, what do you actually, when you go in to vote, remember, you're not looking at candidates. You don't vote for candidates in Israel or these multi-party systems. You vote for the party. But if you have 30 parties in front of you, generally speaking, what are you going to vote? What's going to determine your vote? Well, why would, if there were 30 parties available, like there would be a what? There'd be an environment party. There'd be an abortion party. There'd be a social welfare party. There'd be a paid leave party. There'd be a more greenery for Charlotte party. Actually, Charlotte has more tree cover than any other major city in the United States. One of the advantages of living in Charlotte, aside from its overzealous police force. All right, so do you understand? If you had 30 parties, what would happen to the nature of each party?
You could decide on what's most important.
And wouldn't the definition of each party become narrower and narrower?
Yes.
Almost to the point, which is exactly what you have in Israel, where you have one-party issues, one-issue parties. Now, you could say, well, that's great because if you're voting for that party, at least you know what you're voting for. But then here's where Banfield then asks you to think it through. So, first of all, he asks, what are the typical criticisms of the American two-party system? We've already gone over this. Sabrina, if you want to read that. So what are the criticisms? And I even gave you the page number for his article.
No difference, no real choice.
Have you ever heard that? Have you heard there's no difference between voting Democrat and Republican?
No.
Never.
Well, you're young people. How many of you think there is a difference? I must say, I think now, and you have to see, the two parties do actually broadly represent the same thing. Interestingly enough, both the Republican Party are advocates of a moderate welfare state. That is to say, both Republicans and Democrats agree on Medicare, Medicaid, and some social safety net programs. Does that make sense? both believe in highway spending for infrastructure. Because after all, the one bill passed the Senate with 17 Republican votes. So the two parties do overlap. If you're going to have parties representing 90% of the American people, there has to be some overlap. So some people say the two parties are Tweedledum and Tweedledee. Who tends to make those kind of criticisms? The Socialist Workers' Party of America tends to make the argument that the two parties have no difference. Why?
No, socialist.
Well, compared to socialism, they actually are fairly inseparable. So Banfield says many people make that criticism. Also, he says, to go ahead, Sabrina, if you don't mind.
No discipline over office holders.
And by the way, I think people would say, look at Senator Manson and Senator. If we had more disciplined parties, the congressional parties would spank those people for not voting according to the majority party. So there's no question that within our Congress, members of each party are freer to vote outside the party than almost any other party system in the country, in the world. I should say, if you go to any other parliamentary system, if somebody votes contrary to their party in the parliament, they are kicked out of parliament. So, in other words, there the parties really can discipline. Now, there is a certain sense in which our two parties can discipline members of Congress. You probably don't know who Marjorie Greene is.
Nope.
She was this right-wing Republican that ran in Georgia and evidently was saying crazy things like the forest fires in California were being started by Israeli satellites or something like that.
Oh,
Weird stuff. And so the Republican Party actually took her off of the committee that she served on. They couldn't unelect her because why? How did she get to Congress?
she got elected. She got voted.
By the people of her district.
Yeah.
So the party in Congress can't remove her from Congress. She's independently elected, so she's still in Congress. But what they did punish her by is they took her off the committee. Now, as you know, most of the legislation is written in committee, right? So if your party takes you off of a committee in Congress, it means they actually remove a good deal of influence from you. They can't kick you out of Congress because you're independently elected. Does that make sense? So we do have some discipline, but still, nevertheless, members are freer to vote outside the party. Did you get rid of those guys in your room?
What are they doing?
All you have to do is pass intestinal gas. That'll clear the room out pretty
They
quickly.
have my room too.
I've seen it happen at faculty meetings. All right, so, and the argument is that parties are geographical and they're undemocratic structures. So, Matt, Banfield actually then tries to create a standard. Okay, what's a party supposed to do? So here he lists 5 separate goals, and I forgot to put a number 4. So you see this has 2 3s. It should have a 3 and a 4. So what does Banfield argue the goals of a party system are?
First, preserve society/nation and its good.
So by the way, shouldn't a party or party system work for the good of the nation?
Yes.
Okay, second?
Provide for some choice.
In other words, the difference between the Democrat and Republican Party may not be the difference between the Nazi Party and the Communist Party, but it should have at least some difference. Does that make sense? Third,
Promote public welfare.
it should somehow get people to think about what's good for the whole people, correct? Fourth, this is where the missing 4 is.
Moderate conflict.
The word moderate there is a verb, to moderate conflict. Now, is conflict in politics a good thing or a bad thing? It's probably unavoidable, isn't it? Again, are you married, Sabrina, if I may ask? Have you ever had what's it called, a disagreement with your husband?
Oh yeah.
So probably conflict and marriage are probably inseparable. But isn't it good for married people to have some way of moderating their conflict? Other than, say, putting a 44 in each other's hands.
Jesus.
Which is a bad way to moderate conflict. So conflict is probably inevitable, isn't it? And isn't conflict a way of generating discussion and to some degree points of view? Yet, do you want every political conflict to end up like the Civil War?
No.
So he's saying one thing a party system has to do is it has to acknowledge conflict, give rise to different opinions, but at the same time create structures that moderate and tame some of that conflict. Does that make sense? That's what that means. And last,
Promote democracy.
that means, in other words, if you vote Democratic, and that means that when Democrats get in office, they do kind of have to obey their program. Now, I have to say, something you said, Sammy, is probably true. a lot of politicians make promises in campaigns that they have no intention of fulfilling or don't fulfill.
They do it to get popularity so they get
Or they want to get elected, right? So they promise everything. There is a certain sense in which even Banfield would say a party system has to hold office holders somewhat responsible for what they promise. Does that make sense? That's responsibility. Now, here's how his article works. So, if one designed a party system based on the criticisms, what would be most likely when you look at the criticisms? And what the result would be a multi-party system of pure ideological, impermanent, unstable, conflicted parties. Would that be better or worse than what we have?
Worse.
So this is how Banfield's article. What if you added some of the defects of our present system to that perfect party system? What would happen? And if you look at his passage there on 4141, his argument is it would actually make the unstable multi-party system better. More coalitions would form, there'd be more stability in office, more linkages. So, in some ways, his argument is, yes, the two-party system isn't perfect, but in terms of other party alternatives, either a non-party alternative or a multi-party alternative, his argument is you are not likely to improve the system by changing in that direction. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
I think you could say his argument is an argument for a imperfect but functional present system. I think that's his argument. Does that make sense? Any comments or questions?
Great lesson today.
I love the way you're watering those flowers.
Unfortunately, it's my job.
It could be worse. You could be shoveling manure.
I could.
That's like handling Dr. Dunn's papers.
Or you should be listening for wording.
Yeah, you could
Oh,
be
that's
this
real
class
manure.
twice a day like me.
Oh, I've been through that. Don't worry.
All right. So, any comments or questions? Now we're going to come back to this because I'm going to argue the article I just gave you out somewhat says that within our two-party system there are important factions that affect the way the governance works in the country, and especially. All right. Any comments or questions?
No.
Is class being recorded?
Say what?
Is class being recorded?
Yes.
I even said hi to the camera at the beginning.
TJ, say hello.
No, he doesn't need to say hello. He doesn't even come to class.
And I'll be happy to send this recording to your parents so that they know you're here.
You don't even know his parents is blind.
Your
Hey, if you're
parents
gonna send
too.
it to his parents, tell him he's late every day.
Stop. Tell them that.
I'm supposed to report that TJ is late every day. This is according to Sydney.
It's facts.
TJ, you may want to cut Sydney's tires. All right.
Oh.
So you're looking at today's notes. Let's at least start these today. Here, did you just read, Matt?
Yeah.
So, TJ, are you two freshly sat down to read?
Yes.
I can read.
Sydney. It's time to have Sydney read. So,
Don't you?
the Presidency, Origins and Design.
Yes.
The Nichols Reader, go ahead.
The Nichols Reader presents a distillation of the Federalist Papers 70 through 74. In these papers, Hamilton is defending/explaining the Constitution's controversial embrace of a single powerful executive.
Stop just a second. Do you remember when we talked about the Constitutional Convention and the creation of the Constitution? I said there were three political novelties that the Constitution came up with that had never been done before. One was the huge republic of Federalist 10. The second one was the new federalism that tries to split sovereignty between the national government and the states. And what was the, excuse me? That was a throaty
The
yarn.
third one is having one person executive.
Consistent with free Republican government, because that had never been done before. Had there been strong, vigorous executives prior in human history?
Strong executives?
Yes.
Yes.
They're called kings, dictators, monarchs, emperors, but there had never been a synthesis of a vigorous executive with a free Republican popular-based government. And what Hamilton starts out in Federalist 70 is, there are those who think you can't have these two things at the same time. That is to say, a vigorous executive or an energetic executive and real Republican constitutional government. So he says at the beginning of this paper, by the way, those who make that argument better hope they're wrong. Why? Because it turns out you can't have a good government without an energetic executive. And so he says, if it's true that you can't have an energetic executive, with free government, we're up Schitt's Creek without a paddle. Because that means if you try to create a free government with a weak executive, what's going to happen? It happened under the Articles. What happened to the Articles?
It'll collapse.
Yeah, it'll collapse and ultimately it can't even sustain itself. So there's a reason why God created political scientists.
So that someone like you could have a job.
Here's the reason why God created political scientists. Because Hamilton says that the most important quality of an executive is energy. But then what does Hamilton fail to define?
What energy is?
And that's why God created political scientists, so that political science professors could come along and define what executive is, what energy is. And so the way that I've laid out these notes is I explain what energy is. Then I explain Hamilton does say the 4 tasks or purposes of executive power for which you need energy. Then he goes on to say the institutional ingredients. How do you construct the executive institution to have those, to get those tasks? And last, we'll talk about the passions that lead men into politics, and women too, for that matter. All right, so Sydney, do you see where it says Hamilton, the critical ingredient?
Yes.
So this is the Pulvordian definition of the element that Hamilton says the executive needs, but doesn't define. And what is the definition of energy?
Energy is the capacity for swift, decisive action.
So you understand, and you can see where this argument goes. Why, if Canada suddenly launched 15,000 nuclear weapons against the United States, and it was Congress that had the commander-in-chief power, what would be the problem with making Congress the commander-in-chief?
Because then 500 some people have to agree on what to do.
And
It'd take too long.
And it would take too long, let alone, could you imagine Congress directing an army?
I don't know.
So on one level, you can see how Hamilton's argument goes. If you need energy in the executive, clearly, when it comes to how you build it, you need one or more people. One person. The single person executive. We'll come back to that in a minute. So he says you need energy, and Pulvordi defines energy as the capacity for swift and decisive, even secretive at times, action. Why? What are the 4 tasks that Hamilton says the executive has? Here's the first one. I quote it, and then I try to summarize it. It is essential to the protection of the community against foreign attacks. So what's the first obvious task or business of the executive branch?
Defense.
Do you understand that? And that's, of course, when you look in the Constitution in Article 2, Section 2, as we were reading in the Hamilton class, one of the first things the Constitution gives to the president is the commander-in-chief power. Does that make sense? Second, it is not less essential to the steady administrations of the laws. What do we call that?
Law enforcement.
So, for instance, that ridiculous policeman that gave me a $340 ticket, on one level, from his point of view, what was he doing?
His job.
Protecting the people.
His job.
By enforcing the law. And this is actually, I think these first 2 are very commonsensical, defense and law enforcement. Laws are a good idea. Let's just say for a minute, I don't think I was, but let's just say I was going 53 miles an hour in a 35 mile an hour zone.
Probably was.
Maybe. I don't think so, but maybe if I was, what's the matter with that?
That you could kill somebody.
And so, is it good that I raised this question before, is it good to pass laws that people ignore?
No.
After all, if people start ignoring any law because they don't agree with it, what's going to happen to the fabric of society?
It's going to fall apart.
So, how many of you think everybody simply obeys good ideas because they're good ideas? Or, how many of you think often people obey good ideas because there's a gun to their head?
Yeah.
Not that I'm advocating a gun to your head. Did your parents always get you to do the things you needed to do? Did they try to persuade you?
Yes.
Were you rational creatures at the age of 10 when your parents said, "Please, Tiffany, would you clean up your room?"
No.
And you said, "Why, yes, Mother. I see you as the rational guide of my life. And whatever you tell me to do, I will do without consideration of reward or anything like that." Lexi, when your parents at the age of 15 said, "Lexi, please don't finish that bottle of vodka," and you said, "All right, Mom, whatever you say," Now, did that always happen?
No.
Many times you finished that bottle of vodka.
Give it away.
You see my point?
Shouldn't even drink that.
Do people simply do things because they think they're good ideas?
No.
I have to say it. What does law require? It requires enforcement, doesn't it? And frankly, I have to say, I'm not confessing, but probably when I turn that curve on Rama Road in Charlotte outside my neighborhood,
Now we can figure it out.
I will probably watch my speed more closely than I did before. So my point here is, would law work without law enforcement?
No.
So you understand. So these first two tasks, I think, are pretty commonsensical, aren't they? You need a strong executive to defend the country, and you need a strong executive to enforce the laws. That's pretty clear, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is that clear?
Mhm.
You're looking at me as if I'm a zombie.
No, I'm just thinking about the fact that just because I have your name and what city you live in, I'm able to find your home address.
All right, good. I thought maybe I had such bad breath that you were paralyzed.
No.
Now, the next two tasks, I think, require some translation explanation. He says, to the protection of property against those irregular and high-handed combinations which sometimes interrupt the ordinary course of justice. I think what he means here is, have you ever heard the phrase law and order?
Yes.
Have you ever watched the television, the 900 television shows? The Simpsons actually had a parody of one called Law and Order Elevator Inspection Unit. There's Victims Unit, there's Special Right. But in other words, here's a point I want to make this point. This class is over in about 2 minutes, right?
Right.
How many of you had lunch already?
Sammy
I
has.
have not.
Oh,
Okay.
well, if you're trying to get us to stay longer, dog.
Now, I'm going to presume that once class is over, and you and I say, okay, children, you may go.
We're
And then
not children, we're adults. What do you want from us? You called us adults 2 days ago, and now you're calling us children?
oops.
It's
What
because of
are we?
older people are
What will
always
happen
manipulative.
invariably
You right?
is you will lift up your phones and start to walking into the hallway. You'll get to the door of Carmichael Hall. The moment you get to Carmichael Hall, presuming you're going to G Trough, the dining room, how many of you will crouch and hide on your way over there?
I will not.
In other words, when you walk out of this building, don't you make the simple assumption that it will be a safe journey from this building to G dining room?
What are you coming at, bro?
You assume, in other words, all of us assume that in daily life there's a certain amount of order to society. Yet, how many of you ever existed after a national disaster like a hurricane or an earthquake? What do they almost always declare instantly?
State of emergency.
Because what happens when literally a natural disaster destroys the order of society? Everything's up for grabs. Yet my point here is this: you don't even think about this when you step outside this building. Don't you assume that your Father, by the way, is protecting us? You make the assumption that the society that you're walking out to is safe and orderly. Is it safe and orderly because people are good?
No.
Is it safe and orderly because there are laws?
No.
So think about this. What actually grounds the assumption of safety and security that all of you take for granted?
Nothing. We're just delusional as humans.
Isn't it the fact that there's a police force there? Like it or not, it's the assumption that society has a stable foundation of order that enables us to walk through it without paying attention to it until it's taken away.
Privilege.
It's not privilege. All societies that have order ultimately rest on what Hamilton is calling a strong executive. Do you see my point?
No.
Yes.
All right, I'll stop with the last one and just say it. He says the ordinary and to the security of liberty against the enterprise and assaults of ambition, faction, and anarchy. I think what he means is this. The last task of the executive is actually, and even in popular governments, because our popular government's noisy. Our popular government's noisy.
Yes.
Aren't there a lot of opinions out there and a lot of different votes in a lot of different directions? But yet, doesn't society have to eventually move in one direction?
Yes.
I think Hamilton means by this last one that even in a popular Republican form of government, there needs to be some stable compass point, and that can only come from the executive. You may disagree with the president, or you may agree with the president, but generally speaking, wouldn't it be fair to say that American politics are either reactions to or reactions against presidential proposals? So I think Hamilton thinks without a strong executive, politics would be rudderless. So it's like having a pilot. So defense, law enforcement, stability, and ultimately leadership, the tasks of the executive. We'll pick this up on Friday.